again, a very good morning, evening, afternoon to everyone, depending on wherever you are. My name is Shivam Kishore, and as UNEP's Senior Digital Transformation Advisor, it's my very good pleasure to welcome you all to our third Digital Discovery Session of 2022. We were chatting with David a couple of minutes ago, and I'm coming to you from Vancouver, and it's bright and early here, and David was saying my eyes are squinty still. But I want to tell you, I'm still very excited, even with squinty eyes, to welcome you all, because it's going to be a very exciting session. So now, just a reminder, these sessions, are intended to create spaces where we all can indulge in conversations that intersect two of my favorite topics, technology and sustainability. And anytime we're indulging in conversations, they're much more lively and engaged when they're interactive. So the big part of these sessions is to create a very safe space where all of us can come together and share our thoughts and ideas and questions, more importantly. No question is better or worse than the other, so any questions are welcome. Please put your questions in the chat, and you can even do that as the sessions are undergoing, and I'll take the questions back and try and pose them out to different members of our team as time evolves. So please try and keep the session interactive. Please feel welcome to ask questions, and it'll make the session a lot more interactive. Now, as a part of our lives, the devices have become an extension of us. There's no denying it. And we will have more skin contact with the screens than with our loved ones. And in fact, we will spend about an average of 41% of our lives in front of a screen. That's 8,000 days or 21 years of your life. I want you all to take a second and just reflect on that 21 years of our lives will be spent interacting with the screen. That sounds significant because it is. And we know, when we know that we will interact with technologies for such a big portion of our lives, it becomes very important to translate those interactions into experiences. And I want to focus on this word experience. So in the real world, I mean the world that we right now are not in, because we're talking virtually, but in the real world, when you can touch and feel people, we all know what experiences by and large mean. It's the events that make up our memories. It's those moments, magical or painful, that shape our decision making. And it's the things that we connect with at a very human level. Giving your hug once, a big, nice hug, for example. Now, in the digital world, the question becomes, how do we recreate those experiences that allow people to connect at that level, at that very human level? And that is what brings us to the topic of today's session, human-centered design. Now, at its very core, human-centered design strives to create solutions prioritized for and tailored to the specific needs of the people it serves. Now, we have a very brilliant panel here, some friends, some colleagues, and I'm very excited to talk to them and ask them questions and dive into this idea of human-centered design a bit more to understand what it means, what are its applications, and why is it important to talk about it. Now, is it all good? Of course not. As with any digital technology, there are some concerns which we must talk about. And so we will also dive into that. And through this conversation, what I'm hoping we can get out is at least a high-level understanding and an invitation for all of us to dive into this topic a bit more as we progress our digital journeys all together. So without further ado, very, very excited to introduce you to our panel. We've got three amazing individuals. Aditya Agrawal. We've got, hold on. Can anybody still hear me? I just got a message that I'm muted.
We can hear you. I can hear you.
Amazing, thank you. Yeah, so we've got Aditya Agrawal, we've got Craig Mills, and we've got Pooja Munshi. If I can please invite all the panelists to come up open up their videos and just do a quick introductions of themselves, just telling our audience who they are and who are they with and what do they do. Maybe starting with Aditya first.
Great. Hopefully you can hear me. Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Hi everyone. It's great to be here. Really looking forward to this conversation, and thanks for the invite. My name's Aditya Agrawal. I am the founder of D4D Insights. We're a company that really focuses on how data and technology supports sustainable development, mostly within an international development context. We develop programs such that they really think about, user-centered design, but also from a demand-driven type of an approach where as you're thinking about the solutions to be developed, how are they going to be the solutions themselves? How are they going to be sustainable in the long term? Really incorporate perspective from the communities and the regions that those solutions are meant to serve, and what that means for inclusive governance and such. So we really launch programs and initiatives. Some of the work that we've done is launching Digital Earth Africa. We're working on Digital Earth Pacific. And I've also spent some time with UNEP over the last several months supporting its work on data and digital integration strategy approaches. So what I'll be presenting today will really be leveraging some of that previous work that was done with UNEP, and really kind of focusing on how do we think about developing technology from a demand-driven approach.
Thank you so much, Aditya. It appears to me that you know a thing or two about technology. So very excited to have you here. Thank you again for sharing your expertise. Maybe Craig, if I can pass over to you just to do a quick introduction to audience, let them know who you are.
Yeah, sure, no problem. Thank you, and thanks for inviting me. So my name is Craig Mills. I'm the CEO of Vizzuality. Vizzuality for maybe 10 years now has been building environmental digital systems with a real focus on design and usability. So we've built everything from figuring out where deforestation is happening, illegal fishing is happening, mapping mangroves, creating great collections of spatial information with most of the large intergovernmental and non-profit organizations in the world. I guess maybe I can give you a little bit about me as well. So my background is a biologist turned computer scientist, from the UK government to UNEP, WCMC, and these days into Vizzuality. And I think I'm going to try and distill some of our experiences of building kind of user-centered technology over the last 20 years into something which kind of fits around the idea of human-centered design, and maybe a little bit about the context of how that could work in our space.
Thank you so much, Craig. Then finally, but not the least, I think person who doesn't probably need much introductions, at least in the UNEP world, but Pooja, lovely to have you here. If you can please go ahead and introduce yourselves to the audience.
And of course, hi there. Can you hear me now? Because my mute button decided to misbehave for a second. Okay, I think well, hello everyone, and thanks Shivam for having us. My name is Pooja. I work as head of web at UNEP. But before this, my background started with design, went into strategy. I come from a hardcore digital marketing, advertising background, working on Nike experiences and startups where every dollar and every conversion counted, and it all went down to what was the value for the ultimate user. So my role here, and I will be happy to share some examples, is really trying to bring that rigor into the work that we do. So hoping to share some practical applications of HCD, human-centered design, user-centered design today. Back to you, Shivam.
Amazing. Thank you so much. It's so lovely to have all three of you. And really, so the proceedings of the day are really sort of, we'll start off with Aditya, as you were saying, so then he'll present us or share with us a more high-level overview of what these ideas and principles of human-centered, user-centered. We'll try and then sort of move on to Craig, who can then sort of take this conversation and present it more from how is it being applied to better the planet, to better the earth, and realize better outcomes. And then we'll, go into Pooja, who can bring it back to the UNEP world and say, how are we sort of leveraging, or how can we leverage these principles within a UNEP context? And I think throughout these interspersed will be conversations about, I'll be thinking from it. I'll be thinking about human-centered design from an entirety of a picture where we are not just focusing on all the great parts, but I'll be focusing also on some of the things that need a bit more care and attention. And again, I invite you all, please, to be engaged and share questions as they come to your mind. Just put them in the chat window and I'll collect them and I'll try and intersperse them throughout the conversation. I've got some tough questions already prepared, so I'm hoping not to use them. So if you can get me some good questions, I can let go of our panelists in an easy way. So thank you very much for doing that. Amazing. So without further ado, Aditya, I will let you take the stage. You can start sharing. And this is a quick hope that Teams does what it's supposed to do now.
Okay. All right, great. And I just want to confirm you can see the screen, right?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Okay, cool. All right, well, let me get started here. So, as Shivam was introducing this topic, I'm going to provide an overview of what user-centered design can look like, what are some of the sort of principles and approaches behind it, and some context in terms of how it could possibly apply to UNEP as well. This is going to leverage and build off of some previous work that we've done, both with the digital transformation program and the science division in terms of looking at how data and technology can support UNEP's efforts and what that means for strategies and approaches moving forward. Again, the focus of the recommendations made previously was to how UNEP can really start transitioning more towards a demand-driven approach, such that thinking about user needs and priorities and engagement, both internally to UNEP, across the UN system, and with stakeholders and users across the world, specifically through member countries, how does technology get built in a way that there's going to be a good experience and there's going to be better uptake and usage of the products that are being created. And so, with that, I'll start with one quote here that I like a lot from Steve Jobs, which is, design is not just what it looks like and feels like, design is how it works. And for me, what that really means is that you can create a really pretty site that actually has a good user experience, but the functionality behind it doesn't really solve for the problem. And conversely, you can have something that in the end will solve for the problem, but there's no way that the user can actually get there because the user experience itself is just so bad. So you really got to think through, what is the user experience look like? What is the context that you're working within? Who is the user that you're trying to work for? And what is the problem that you're trying to solve for? So from that perspective, let me just offer a bit of a definition here on user-centered design as an iterative design process in which designers and other stakeholders focus on the users and their needs in each phase of the design process. Design teams involve users throughout the design process through a variety of research and design techniques to create highly usable and accessible products. And so I think, with that particular definition, what this is really trying to focus all of us on is how do we understand the user and the context that they're working within in order to then create the products and solutions that's going to be able to support solving for their problems. And just to provide a bit of a context in terms of where all of this work is fitting within. At one level, UNEP itself is aspiring to become more relevant at the country level, and digital transformation, data and technology is going to be one way that it can do that. Technology developed by UNEP has users and stakeholders internal to UNEP across the UN system and globally, which I said previously, and so that kind of speaks to the scale at which UNEP works, and that will have some dependencies in terms of the methods of user-centered design that are appropriate to UNEP. Again, you will really want to understand the user, their needs and requirements, and really their broader perspective is really integral to the full kind of technology development process. And for some, just addressing human-centered design or user-centered design seems most like a daunting task because often you'll think that there just isn't enough time or money or resources or, maybe the expertise in how to do it. But really, if you don't do it, you're going to end up having to spend a lot more money in the long term, because by including users early on in the process, it's going to provide a cost benefit in the long term, essentially, because now you're really bringing their perspective into how those technology solutions are designed. And so, a general approach that is often described for how you go about user-centered design, and just to clarify, just kind of a distinction between user-centered design and human-centered design is that they're often used interchangeably, but user-centered design can be considered kind of a subset of human-centered design, in the sense that all users are humans, but not all humans are going to be your users. Therefore, when you're developing your particular solution, it really requires a deeper analysis and understanding of that user and who your target audience is going to be. And so that's really, the first step of going through user-centered design, is to identify the people who will use your product, what will they use it for, and under what conditions. That then leads to building out the requirements. And this is business requirements, user goals that must be met in order for that product to be successful. Then you want to really go through the development of the solution itself, the design of the solution itself, and that's going to go through several stages, going from concept to complete design. And then you want to be able to evaluate, is it meeting the goals and the requirements that were initially set? And is the and trying to do that through quality testing is going to be really important. But the key to all of this is that user-centered design is an iterative process based on the steps that you're going through, and especially once you get to the evaluation stage, you are then iterating. You're either going back and you didn't understand the context from the very beginning and you're redesigning, or there's been other steps that you want to redesign for when you're looking at the requirements or the design itself based on the evaluation that you're doing of the overall product. So some key principles behind user-centered design is, I've said this several times now, but it's really sort of the thing that you have to underline when it comes to user-centered design, is have a clear understanding of the user and the business requirements. You want to be able to incorporate that feedback throughout the design process. You want to have early and active involvement of your users throughout the process. Integrate user-centered design throughout the technology development activities, and really do this as an iterative approach. So, the starting step for user-centered design is really identifying your target audience, your end users, who will be the users of your product. Why would these users be interested in that product? How will they use it? What problems is it trying to solve for? And how does it really improve their overall business process? And so to do that, you start with this kind of stage where you want to start defining what the use case looks like. But before that, you have to create a persona of who your user is, understand the scenario, and then how that then sort of develops the use case overall. And so a persona, and I'm sure a lot of people already know a lot of this, so I'm just going to try to provide a general overview on the approach. But the persona is really kind of a representation of a particular group of end users. They have similar patterns of behavior. Their needs might be similar, their roles might be similar, they have similar goals, and you can have multiple personas that you're creating given the different types of users that are going to be engaging with your product. The persona supports the decision-making process about what product features should be included, what should the functionality look like, what is the visual design, the outputs that are created, and it also supports how the various functions and design process gets prioritized to meet the user needs. The scenarios then builds on the persona by articulating what actually happens in the daily life of that user. You're getting a much more detailed understanding of the problems that that user is trying to solve for. And then from both of those, you're then creating the use case. You're describing how these steps translate into a series of steps the user would do in order to be able to achieve that goal. And so how will the solution be used to basically solve the problem that the user has now articulated to you as their requirements? And so I created a persona here. I'd like you to meet Simon Okello. He works for the Ministry of Environment. And this is completely hypothetical, so just there. Simon Okello is actually the name of a person that I met in Hawaii recently from Kenya, so I'm borrowing his name. I hope he doesn't mind. But Simon, in this example, Simon works for the Ministry of Environment in Nairobi. He is a data analyst and working for the Ministry of Environment. He's really looking for data that's going to be able to support the different types of analyses that he's working towards. He wants to be able to find data easily. He wants data to be API enabled so that it can be ingestible in different platforms that he's working with. And then he wants access to proven tools and algorithms that are going to allow him to do the right kinds of analysis on the data that he's going to be able to find. He's frustrated, though, because it's difficult to find data. There's a proliferation of data portals out there, and being able to find the right data set is difficult. And then often there's issues around data quality. You don't have metadata that's associated with the data. And in the work that he's doing, he's just having to work on too many projects at the same time. So for this particular use case, Simon is conducting an air quality assessment for Kenya. He needs to find good data for that assessment. He looks to UNEP to see what global data might be available in addition to the country level data that Kenya already has. And Simon wants to find that useful data and do the analysis that's going to be able to support the assessment that he's looking to do. That's the kind of definition that you want to be able to try and identify early on, because what you're really trying to now do is, okay, now that we sort of understand who Simon is, what his sort of behavior and background looks like, and the specific problem that he's trying to solve for, how do we create now a solution that's going to be able to support that? And once you get to the part where you're gathering these user needs and you're also doing the evaluation of those user needs, there's a number of different methods that get applied for this. Everything from focus groups where you're bringing together actual users. They're able, and this is in a group format, they're able to share their thoughts, feelings, knowledge, and ideas about a particular issue. They're used for input into the design process itself, and this is more like a qualitative level assessment, to usability testing, which is where you're really evaluating a product or a website by collecting data as people use it. Users will be asked to perform a series of tasks while the moderator is taking notes, and any sort of difficulties or challenges that are encountered as that user is interacting with that technology are then noted. There's automated computer tools that also do the same thing. Card sorting provides input to the design in a way that suggests different categories of content that drives the overall system's information architecture. Participatory design is a method that's similar to a co-design approach. You're not just asking about opinions or needs, but really actively involving users throughout the design and decision-making process. You'll usually use participatory design more for like mini projects to generate product prototypes. It's often not the only method that you're going to apply when you're doing user-centered design. Questionnaires are useful when you
Aditya, I believe you muted yourself accidentally.
Oops. Okay, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Thank you.
Okay. So questionnaires are useful for when you can't get access to directly to users, or the sample size that you're looking for is much larger than feasible to do through direct contact. It's really important, obviously, if you're going to do a questionnaire approach, that the survey is designed really well. And for an organization like UNEP that is working at the global scale, to some extent, questionnaires is likely going to be one of the methods, not the only method, but one of the methods that you will have to kind of think about in using. And then the interviews, really allow for more one-on-one engagement with a potential user. It allows for much of a deeper understanding, really getting to understand their unique point of view around the needs and requirements that they're looking for in that technology. So, and again, like with the work that we had done previously on data and digital and data integration across UNEP, we also want to think about user-centered design in the context of agile development methodology. This is a graphic that was proposed within that strategy, where you're really working across this life cycle with a focus on user-centered design, where you're engaging users through a planning process to identify what those needs and requirements are. You're designing with users in mind, especially their requirements and profiles and the conceptualization of that product. You're developing the product at a prototype or MVP level, and then really sort of going through iterations in terms of what the user's feedback is on that prototype. You're testing, iterating, and then as you're deploying, you have a number of metrics and tools in place that allow you to monitor usage and performance. And based on that usage and performance, then you're conducting a review process that allows you to, really think about whether you're meeting the goals of the initial plan and requirements. And, depending on the, what the outcome of that is, you're either iterating again or starting all over again. So I think, the real sort of foundation of that is you have to allow yourself to make mistakes, not fully understand, from the very beginning what the technology should be solving for, but by having engagement with your users to really guide and inform that process, it's really then focused on being able to iterate on that development process until you get to the point where you have a solution that is making your users happy and solving for the problem. And so just to wrap up, what does this all mean in the context of UNEP? At one level, integrating a user-centered design approach is going to require a bit of a cultural shift for UNEP. I think that there has been examples of where user-centered design and human-centered design have made its way into technology development at UNEP, but it's something that should become more mainstream in how UNEP thinks about how technology should be developed. There has to be more of a focus on understanding your users. Given the reach that UNEP has, certain user-centered design methods like focus groups or usability testing, interviews and questionnaires are likely to be more useful. And I think the comment that I would also just kind of wrap up with is that for me, any sort of technology development process is really about the trust and relationships that are built in order for those solutions to be sustainable in the long term and actually have the uptake and usage that we're all looking for. So by going through these user-centered design approaches, you're not only just making the product better, but you are building that trust and relationship with the users and the stakeholders that you're working with, which is critical to any kind of a design process and is only going to make your product more successful down the road. So let me stop there, Shivam. Thank you.
Thank you, Aditya. Thank you very much. I hear some echo, so if everybody else can be on mute, please, we'll really appreciate it. Just prevents background noises and any echoes from creeping in. Thank you. Now, that was really fascinating. Now, I think before we jump into Craig and Pooja, who will further help realize this idea with some examples, there's been some really important questions that have been brought up by people in the chat, and I really appreciate them. And I would like all of us collectively, particularly Aditya, Craig, Pooja, if I can throw out some questions to see if I can invite some responses from you all before we move on to Craig. Now, one important question that has been asked in various forms is this idea of what do we do when your user has a fair amount of intersectionality, whether that's based on gender, whether that's based on nationality, where it's much easier. So I come from a background of management consulting with some of the largest private firms, and then I've been in the government. And so for me, when I was working on a client, I can go out to them and conduct a bunch of surveys. I can conduct face-to-face interviews, but it's within the context of that organization. So I'm able to draw a fair amount of commonality that allows me to present a product or a service in a fair bit of coherent manner. But now, in the case of UNEP, for example, if you're working with 193 countries, in some cases, it can be a bit more complicated to do so. And also, more importantly, in today's world, we're looking at the intersectionality of gender as well. We're looking at the intersectionality of different nationalities. And so that brings about a bit more difficult question on how we undertake this process. Maybe, Aditya, just some quick thoughts from you on how do we approach this conversation, and then maybe some thoughts from Craig and Pooja as well. So maybe Aditya with you first, and then we'll jump in with the others.
Yeah, maybe I'll take a first crack at that. So, I mean, I think that there's, one of the things that the presentation is trying to show is that there are these different methods. Some are more scalable than others, right? Obviously, trying to get to a level of interaction specifically directly with users for a global institution can seem like a daunting task, but there are ways to do that. And there's a way that you can also use questionnaires as a way to kind of scale that approach as well. And so just to give an example, in the Digital Earth Africa program, we were working across 54 countries on that program. And the way that we kind of approached user engagement happened organically in many ways, but with some design behind it. So we had a governance mechanism that included a number of countries, so they were part of the decision-making process from the very beginning. That then opened up entry into the countries to be able to then engage with various users at a technical level. For technical users across government, an informal user group was established, and it was initially established so that we could then work with users to help them understand what Digital Earth Africa was all about, what's it intended to do, and what are the needs and priorities across your organizations and the problems that you're working with. That then kind of evolved into almost like a community of practice, where all of those users were now engaging with one another around the work that they're doing, exchanging lessons learned, etc. And that whole process then allowed us to capture what are the problems, who are the users, what are the specific needs and priorities that they're looking for, and how do they want to engage with this program, right? So that was one sort of equivalent of a focus group that we were able to use in that context. Separate to that, we also had like a scientific product development group that was established. We were working through a distributed operational model, leveraging other institutions in Africa that had experience on how geospatial and Earth observation data could be applied. From a scientific perspective, obviously, when you're looking at things like food security or water quality, all of these, there's been institutions that have been doing that kind of work for decades on the continent, right? And so you want to be able to leverage that knowledge and expertise. So we brought them together also to then inform the science in terms of how the algorithms should be created and what these end products could actually look like in terms of how they would then be applied within the institutions that they're working in. And so I guess in summary, I don't think that there's one method that applies to everything. I think you have to be very creative about trying to figure out how to balance the methods that are being applied, that one does allow you to get to the right cross-section of users at some level of scale across the geographies that you're working with, but then also deploying other methods that allow for the scalability that you need in order to have the right sample without knowing that you can't necessarily get to every user.
Thank you for that. I think what I'm hearing at least is, so there's no magic bullet in the sense, but really it's an attempt to take in multiple tools that are at our disposal and put them in an interesting way, in an intelligent way that allows us to come to a certain output that we are hoping to achieve. Maybe Craig, Pooja, anything from you to add to that? Because that's quite an important question there. Oh, sorry, everybody else can go on mute again. I hear some sounded like a smoothie mixture, but it's I
Sorry,
don't know if that's
my wife making smoothies upstairs.
There we go. That was not fairly wrong. I mean, that's what happens when you make enough smoothies. You can recognize the smoothie mixer from the background. Brilliant. Craig, Pooja, any insights from you on that one?
Okay. Sorry, go on, Pooja.
Okay, I wanted to maybe take a stab at that question from another angle. So I think a couple of things. The way it's really understanding segments, right? And I believe that the success of user-centered design, taking a page from Aditya's book, is really based on how you design the structure and the feedback loop, right? What you decide to put in your toolbox, if you will. So, for example, if you're working on a campaign, we ensure that the focus groups have the gender, being at UNEP, have that gender balance, have that global South and global North balance, so that we can bring in responses and we can understand the difference and the texture of difference between those two and find a medium that perhaps answers both. But I also want to talk about the delivery of the platform itself. For one, we know that broadband 5G is not available in every country. So we're often looking at low-tech solution as well as high-tech to deliver at various ranges. And more often than not, I see, while we are so different, there is a common strain in the way we tap our phones, in our digital behavior on our devices is becoming very, very similar. And so while we have to design and for the needs of these multiple segments, there is also this convergence with, more internet, more bandwidth that we're looking at. So I just wanted to mention that as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Pooja. So I think it's really about, again, just driving in those intersections where even though on surface it seems there's a lot of variance, if we can go down to a bit more granular level and deeper enough, we can sort of start to pull out certain commonalities that allows us to then position a cohesive picture. Is what I'm hearing. Maybe Craig, any final thoughts from you? Because this is a question I think that's coming up again, rightfully so, because in the world of and in global undertakings, we are working with very many different audiences, and so taking something from such a diverse population base and putting a cohesive picture, it's not an easy task, certainly.
Yeah, sure. So I'll just add something small because the answers have been fantastic so far, which is around the idea of human universals. I don't know how much people are aware of that concept, but it's sort of building on what Pooja said about this. Everyone taps a phone in similar ways. Actually, there are a series of human universals that are applied to most technology. So if you're looking at trying to apply applications across a wide variety of the population, then those applications need to be doing things which apply universally across those populations. And if they're not, you probably need to segment them into smaller pieces and have a much more targeted application. And it's a concept which is well known in the worlds of Silicon Valley and stuff, when they're looking at trying to reach billions of people, that you only try and reach billions of people if you're talking about, I don't know, communication, the love of nature, religion, etc., etc., etc. These kind of big, broad areas which cover large groups of populations. I think the problem that UNEP sometimes, or not just UNEP, actually, lots of global organizations find themselves, is that although they're operating at global scales, their conversation doesn't necessarily apply at a national or an individual level. So the lovely thing about human-centered design is you get to see that. You get to learn about that and then see where the segments lie. And as long as you're kind of comfortable enough with the idea of going, oh, my initial idea of doing everything for everyone perhaps might not be the right one, we need to do something different. As long as you're willing to accept that and change, and you actually have enough funding to do those things, then you're in the good place.
I think, Craig, I think this is excellent, right? Because again, I think essentially, if we have to boil this down again, you can correct me if I'm not, but at least for me, the way it appears is we have more in common than we would like to imagine as a population. And I think really when it comes to looking at human-centered, user-centered designs, it's really about trying to identify those commonalities through different techniques that we have all highlighted here, that Aditya has particularly highlighted here, and sort of trying to see how can we intersect them and come up with a common coherent picture. And I think there's a lot of questions coming around the specificities of the application of it, which I think is as a prime moment for Craig to jump in and maybe dive in with this conversation, because I think it'll be nice to see how can we take these principles and actually apply them in a bit more practical manner, which I think will start to dive into some of the questions that are coming in, and then we can address them after the second half. So Craig, take it away.
Just double checking everyone can see my screen.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So when well, yeah, first of all, thank you again for allowing me to speak. When I was first asked to talk about human-centered design, my first question was, does Vizzuality do human-centered design? Is that what we do? And so on reflection, we kind of do a version of it. And then the second question that came along was, okay, so if we are doing human-centered design, which humans are we centering the design on? And so in Vizzuality, for those that aren't aware of our organization, we have for probably just over 10 years now worked on something like 300 environmental, social good digital products, working with many of the organizations you know, including your own. And in that time, I think, let's see, we have worked with something like 5,000 people in these organizations. Well, let's call them humans to keep it right. 5,000 of these humans in these organizations, and the number of users that are using these applications are something in the region of 20 to 30 million. Then if you look at the number of people in Vizzuality that have been building these products alongside our partners, then you're talking about, well, actually not very many, another 150, 200 people. And so then there's lots of people that you need to consider when building these applications, right? But before I get to that, it did give me the opportunity to reflect a little bit on what is the context that Aditya mentioned behind the environmental digital products, because they're not quite like most products, right? So in the very simplest form, if I'm a company or a maker building an application, building let's say a mobile phone app, I sell that to users. Users either buy it from me or they don't. And if they don't buy it from me, I'll have a great existential crisis, and I'll have to figure out why not, and I'll have to learn about those users. And there's a natural financial feedback loop in terms of me discovering why people do or do not want to use the applications that I've made, right? In the world of, well, in our world, it's not quite like that. Typically what happens is you'll get donors and what I call brokers of impact, which sounds better than intergovernmental organizations. Brokers of impact, they sound more like superheroes, right? So they get together and they have a theory of what what technology can be used to solve a world problem. Okay, very noble and very great. And then hopefully those donors pass over some money, and then that enables that organization to then go and make something. Okay, but if you look at actually the financial flows in that, donors give money to the brokers of impact, say UNEP or WWF or IUCN or whoever, and then they internally or externally, say if they're working with someone like Vizzuality, then ask those makers to create technology, design technology, hopefully using some form of user-centered design or human-centered design. Now, the interesting thing is here, if everyone gets paid, regardless of whether anyone uses the product or not. And I think that's important to establish, because that does lie, I think, at one of the reasons as to why users are not often included in this process. It's not because people don't care about users, but the underlying systemics of the sector kind of doesn't. It means you don't have to unless you really want to. So you have to drive it a bit harder. You have to have a bit of impact, have a bit of care to really want to get into the user stuff. It also means typically then not as much money is given over for understanding users and working with them. But then you may say to me, Craig, come on, it's not just about money, it's about other things too. And that's certainly true in the case of, let's say, the production of data. So here, instead of looking at kind of the financial flows, let's look at the cultural capital, or to put it another way, let's see if status changes as a result of the production of data. So in this case, donor goes to, say, WWF, and they go, well, we really want a global data set on fish farms. Right, so they're interested in aquaculture, and WWF go, yeah, that would be excellent. That's right up our street. We'll get our data scientists and scientists to work on this problem, and they go and they produce a data set on fish farms. At that moment, status raises in everyone. Like the person doing the data science has a new thing which is out there, and they're well known for that, and their status rises. WWF. Status increases because it looks like they're doing something important on fish farms, and the donor looks like they're increasing impact. Then equally on top of that, they go, well, let's share this into the sustainability community because others might be interested in this. And those others may use that information, but not necessarily pay for it. But again, across the board, cultural capital increases as well as others as well. But let's just stick with that one for now. And so you go, great, this is good. The production of new knowledge also has an effect on the status and cultural capital of the organizations and the individuals involved in the process. Actually, normally this is where a non-commercial license restriction gets wrapped around data, because you think, okay, everyone's happy, so we're all good. We don't have to worry about anything else. Sometimes you get faced with, I don't know, a big food company like Nestle or Unilever or Danone or Mars or someone like that comes in and goes, actually, knowing where all the fish farms are is really useful to us because that would help us with understanding our sustainability targets. And so then normally there's some kind of partnership created. And what that bond does, it actually, sometimes there's money exchanged, but sometimes there's not. But what the bond does is it accelerates the cultural capital within all the organizations again. And so it's seen as a good thing, which it generally is. Now, what happens if there's someone out there who would like to use the information but no one knows about? In this case, it kind of breaks that bond of cultural capital unless they participate in the sustainability community more directly, right? So there's this idea that whether it's financial, cultural, symbolic, political capital, none of those things are raised as a result of someone outside the group being able to use the data or the technology. Okay, so there is some kind of flaw in the way in which we currently organize ourselves in terms of the production of knowledge and work. Now, I just wanted to give it's a bit of a human-centered design way of looking at it, but looking at the context first. Next, we need to look at digging into a little bit more about the concept of which humans we do center the design on. And even then, it's not as simple as we always use the users, right? So if we look at this rough, similar to Aditya's outline, this rough process of we listen, we gather information, we create ideas, we prototype, then we test it, and we go through that a few times, and then we make, and we repeat that cycle over and over and over again. When we do that, and who we do that with is really a matter of timing. Because in the beginning, what we found with most of the really successful projects is actually not about the users. It is about humans, but it's not about the users. If you take an example, the resolution of this isn't great, must be in the video. So if you take this example of a project we worked on with Trace, with the Stockholm Environment Institute and the Global Canopy project, we were looking at the flows of agricultural commodities and where those commodities originated from and what was the impact on the land in those places. Now, this may seem like a possibility today. There's a bunch of initiatives like this, but when this first started, this idea that you could actually say, if this commodity that I bought from over here, this soy that I bought from here, has been directly impacted this municipality in Brazil over here seemed a really unlikely thing to be able to track at a global scale. And so the first step along this chain was not so much about getting users to use the application. It was about building consensus, excitement, selling the idea, and ultimately raising funds in order to do this thing at the scale appropriate to change whole systems, to change commodity markets, to change businesses and exporting countries. So in the beginning, this really wasn't so much about users. It was about understanding what those donors and the brokers of impact needed. It was about understanding what was necessary to sell the idea in order to raise enough money to do this thing properly. So that's, if you like, the startup stages of this. Largely, you didn't have to think too hard about the users, not in the traditional sense. You had to think about the humans that were likely to make this thing a success or a failure, right? Then, once you've done that, and hopefully you've raised enough money to keep this thing sustained, I would say minimum 5 years, add a decent amount of revenue, a decent amount of income. I'm trying to think of the words that are normally used in UNEP because I tend to use like business words. And I remember when I joined a company using words like client and sale and business and things like that, kind of felt a bit weird to me. But anyway, I'll keep going. But once you get to that point, then it's about users, right? So it's it really is. This is when you absolutely go to town on user-centered design. This is when it becomes really important. And along the way, you learn all sorts of really interesting things. So another one of our pieces of work is a project called Global Forest Watch, which we've worked on with the World Resources Institute. And in the beginning, similar to Trace, they had to convince the world that it was possible to be able to look at forest loss and forest gain across the world, you know, on a very regular basis at high resolution from satellites. And so the initial versions of this were data that was working at maybe a yearly scale at a reasonably low resolution and not working in everywhere in the world. But it was about building hope, making people feel that it was actually possible to do some of these things. And then once the money was raised, then we could start turning attention to different groups and different people that wanted to use this type of information. They could use it for change. Now, along that pathway, other things changed as well. The technology evolved. In the beginning, it was really hard to do this type of analysis. And then projects like Google Earth Engine, Microsoft's Planetary Computer, all the big cloud operators now are operating these ability to do this huge volumes of analysis where we couldn't back then. But now it's much easier. So now what we're finding is we're getting much higher resolution, both temporally and spatially. And so now you can say where forest loss is happening every 3 days. Actually, that changes quite significantly the users. So in that case, once you get down to 3 days, we made a mobile phone applications for forest rangers in Peru, which allowed them to say, well, over there, 3 miles away, there was a deforestation alert. Well, let's go and find out what happened. That's a very different use case. There's a very different demand on an application than like yearly sort of trends in deforestation. So that was really cool to see that along the way. And sometimes you have to preempt what's coming in the future, maybe predict, oversell a little bit to be able to kind of sell the idea of something that could happen in the future. Anyone who's ever done this type of work probably does this all the time. And then the problem you got there is then you have to do it again, right? So then it's no longer about users again, and it's back to being about building, building excitement to raise more money, whether that's within a program of work or whether that's through new philanthropic donations, wherever it's from. You have to go through that cycle again. And the cycle is typically, I've been doing this, let's say, for about 20 years now. It's probably about every 5 to 6, 7 years that you then have to reintroduce the ideas of what will come in the future. And so your human attention goes less away from the users again and more towards the people that have the ability to make sure this thing is a success. So often that's the donors or your community around you. All right, so a good example of this might be Resource Watch. So in the beginning, this was largely about there wasn't a decent place to go and get global scale curated information on all sorts of topics around sustainability and bring them together and like view them together and like build stories around those and build insights around those. And there's more and more of those type of tools available now. Sometimes it can get confusing, but this idea around Resource Watch is currently going through the next cycle. So what does the next thing look like? And a good question to ask yourself when you are going through this: what are the hidden data that will change decisions? Quite often in all of these technologies, there's a piece of knowledge which isn't apparent to someone that can actually make a real difference in the world, in their decisions. And so what is that? I mean, just from conversations I had the other day, I'd argue that one of the key things is understanding where crops are on a weekly, monthly basis across the entire planet. Certainly for supply chains, that would help hugely. All right, and so just when you think you've got it all sorted, you understand the system in which this project is oriented, you understand the users that you're trying to target, you have all your funding necessary to do the project, then the world moves on again, and where you thought you were dealing with a particular group of humans, you now realize there's others that become interested in over time, right? And so what Vizzuality has seen in maybe the last 3 years is a huge increase in demand from the private sector, from companies wanting similar types of systems that we've been developing for open data, environmental, social good initiatives. And now they're wanting them internally because companies are making all these new promises, often more ambitious than maybe some countries. And they're now going, oh my God, I've got to figure out how I'm going to do it, how am I going to implement it? So they need a combination of digital and sustainable transformations within their businesses, often centered around really good high resolution spatial data, certainly the big multinational companies. And so one response to this demand has been our work on a product called Land Griffin. And the idea behind Land Griffin is, again, sticking with supply chains as the example, allowing companies, in the case of mainly food companies, who are wanting to understand the impacts of their supply chains on things like forests, water, carbon, biodiversity, and being able to give them immediate analysis of the impact of their operations. Again, when we first begun this, we thought we could supply software to do it. In reality, there's a whole change process that has to happen along the way around digital transformation. Many times there's Excel sheets spread across thousands of desks across organizations, and organizing those into one place in order to produce these type of statistics is a huge undertaking and a real cultural shift in many organizations. However, once they do have it, being able to do some sorts of scenario testing, so looking at what happens if my business changes over time in particular areas, what happens if my subsidiaries change over time and I start buying different commodities over time, what does that look like in terms of reality today and the reality in the future? Even more than that, you could go beyond that and look outside the world, which is also changing quickly, with the climate emergency and the loss of biodiversity. What does that actually mean as well? And so then we can start running those scenarios and giving visualizations on what happens in those companies as they intervene in their operations to make them more sustainable. One more point I'd add on the companies thing. There's a double factor at play here. On the one hand, individual companies can pull their own levers to make themselves more sustainable, but on their own, that's clearly, as we know, not enough. It has to be connected with what their contribution is to at the global scale, which is where organizations like UNEP play a huge role. If a company here is making these changes, they need to understand if their change has any sort of change in the dial, and what they need to do as more of a community to change things. So UNEP plays an important role in defining the global standards against this. Sorry, my computer's running a bit slow. So there we go. All right. So I just wanted to reiterate these listen, idea, prototype, test, and make idea. In particular, when we're looking at this, what I've said before is the first step is probably one of the most crucial things: who you listen to and when you listen to them, and then you build ideas around there. And then the other side of the coin is really important, which is often, funnily enough, overlooked, which is about how you make it and the skill sets of the people making the tools that you want to make. I'm not saying this because well, no, I suppose I am saying this because Vizzuality are filled with a bunch of makers, but you shouldn't underestimate the challenges of that. Building technology and the people building technology they're not commodities. So finding the right people for the right task is a really important thing. And I wanted just to finish with, well, actually, Mike, I'm not going to talk too much about planet-centered design, but I did want to finish with this because after going through this exercise of thinking through the organization and thinking through how our projects sit in the context of our sector, I reached the conclusion that we don't need human-centered design. Actually, what we do need is planet-centered design, because our work is always this balance between what are the needs of individuals and users combined, sort of the egocentric view, compared to what are the needs of the planet. Well, none of us enter any of these initiatives without some higher purpose in mind. And so whilst you can optimize technology for people and individuals, really that has to be balanced closely with what we're trying to do at a whole global societal level. This concept of planet-centered design, unfortunately, I wish it was, but it's not mine. It's been around for probably about 5 years now. And it does look a little bit more at adopting this kind of mix of the two things, and definitely taking maybe a slightly longer term look at technology development. So I put this there as a point to read up on about later, but that is it for me for now. So I hope you enjoy the talk.
Wow, that was excellent, Craig. I mean, I don't know about you all, but I was about to I get really excited in general, but I was about to get more excited when he said, I'm going to introduce the idea of planet-centered design. And I almost sunk in my seat. I'm like, oh no, then he's like, oh no, we have to talk about it later, or go read up on home on your own time. I'm like, come on, you can't do this right now. So I think it's just, it just means we have to come back for this conversation later. But I think it's an incredibly important point, and thank you so much for bringing it up, because I do feel, even in my own experiences, that this evolution from a more human-focused way of governing the world and our practices and our services and our products must transition to a more planet-centered way of functioning, just to ensure the sustainability of all that we're producing and servicing. So I think that's an incredibly important point, and I think all of us will certainly go and read up on it a bit more, and then I think that's just invites a future conversation. I think Paulina, who's been helping us with the poll, thank you so much. She's got a very interesting question that will be upcoming your way, all of you, just for a poll so we can get some census on how we are feeling. But Craig, excellent presentation again. If you can indulge the child in me for a second, you had a slide there that had some stick figures. Now, one of those stick figures particularly stood out to me, and I want to get a quick insight on what were you thinking on that stick figure. Because it's a stick figure, if you can just roll back to the slides, it's the first slide with the stick figures, and it's a stick figure that appears to be pushing a person off planet Earth. And it seems like it's a good kick in the arse, and the person's gone, it's like flying off to the ether. And I must say, it's one of the most brilliant stick figures I've seen in a long time.
So the funny thing about the stick figure was there was another circle there, and I just deleted some of them, and it left that one behind. And I thought, oh, that's too good to delete as well. There was unfortunately, there's no philosophical reason for it at all. I thought it was funny. But yeah, maybe it does mean something. I don't know. It probably doesn't. If there's any donors on this call, it probably doesn't help them that we're pushing. But there we go. Yeah, and I'm sorry about the planet-centered design teaser. I suppose I realised that actually that's an hour-long. Sorry, that's my timer going off. It's an hour-long discussion in itself, so I didn't want to just touch on it too lightly, because it's a much deeper, interesting discussion for another time.
Absolutely, and I think will certainly demands a further conversation. I think one question that again I saw on the threads come up, that's quite interesting. I would love to get all your thoughts on. Is this idea where in the work, particularly that an organization like UNEP undertakes, is there a possibility from a user-centered, human-centered, planet-centered design perspective where we're able to consolidate a lot of data in the background? And then when it comes to leveraging a face front or presenting it, is it possible to have different skins based on the audience we're working with? Is that something that you've seen work quite effectively well? I mean, I can think of, from my examples, Netflix as an example, where, even you've got those certain commonalities in how all of us interact with that particular platform, it's still quite catered to the particular individual in terms of the content it delivers. Now, in platforms like, for example, Craig, the one you presented on biodiversity, for example, a lot of work that UNEP undertakes particularly, what are your thoughts on, is something like that a possibility, and what are sort of the pain points associated with undertaking something like that?
Yes. So most definitely there are really good examples of where there's sort of an underlying infrastructure of data and sort of data interfaces which then can be reapplied in different forms on the front end, and that happens at different ways. And I can think of three. The first one, if you use Global Forest Watch as a good example, right? That's a long-running, well-funded technology project, and it underlying it is a baseline of a variety of data sets, not least the deforestation, right, or forest loss and forest gain data set. Now, in the original, and actually this speaks to some of the other questions in there as well, in the early days of Global Forest Watch, once the funding had been reached, the idea was to go, okay, we're going to have this baseline of data, and then there are different verticals, different sectors that we're going to go after, whether it's commodities, fires, I can't think of other ones right off the top of my head now, but and other groups, conservation community and other ones. And so we built separate, not just Vizzuality, but other organizations as well, built applications for each of those groups, which seemed very specific to them. And then I think what was realized through all the learnings that happened around that, there was actually very similar, and this is a concept of software development as well, called jobs to be done. There's a very similar concept of jobs to be done across multiple platforms. And actually what ended up happening was people were just going back to the main one in the middle, like the main flagship Global Forest Watch. It was the one which probably had the highest amount of resources applied to it, and so usability was better, speed was better, those kinds of things. So for that's one thing, which is like, yeah, there might be reasons to split off. It's absolutely certain you need a decent level of data infrastructure underneath the whole thing to make that happen, and target those ones. But the main result of that was a clarifying of what jobs were necessary using that information for most people. So actually, some of those got shut down and they got reabsorbed back into the main application again. So that's one side. However, on the flip side of that, there's also, like I said in the presentation, mobile phone applications which are used in a very direct way, but just for a very specific need. Where are deforestation events happening near me? And so, and in that one, then you can do that really nicely on a mobile interface, because you don't need all the bells and whistles of everything else around the outside of it. You just need that particular job, right? And that doesn't apply to everyone, that just applies to them. So in those cases, mobile phone applications in that situation are really useful for that. But again, it requires high speed, low latency data transfer to enable those mobile phone applications to work in those places. So there's some work to be done there. And then there's a third one, which is around, you don't necessarily need different applications. So again, I'm just throwing lots of concepts, but there's a concept called progressive disclosure, and the idea that you don't give everyone all the information at once to begin with. So you just give the nugget of information, which is enough to like fulfill the necessary need in that moment. And then if people are really interested and want to spend their time on it, then they go in and then they develop more, and then you can get really complicated. And then you can get, so complicated, if you hit that to start with, no one would have any idea. But because you're progressively introducing people into this information, then you get away with this kind of change in user. And what tends to happen was people use things more and more and more. When you get to that, like people will just jump straight to the most complicated because they've used it loads of times and they understand it. It's a bit like, I don't know, do you remember those old systems in like receptions of sports centers and stuff where there was a booking systems, and there's these like crazy key combinations on the keyboard which were the operators would use to like navigate around all their forms, and they could do it at lightning speed. That's kind of progressive disclosure from like the 1980s, but maybe I'm alone in observing that from then. But
it's a fantastic analogy. I would have never thought of it, but now that you say it, I can't unthink it. So that's a brilliant analogy. Thank you for doing that to my brain.
That's all right.
Aditya, Pooja, any further comments from you on this particular concept. And I think in order, I mean, I can build upon that question as I invite you to come in, is something that, again, a couple of people have asked is really about creating boundaries. And we've got a lot of users in use cases. How do we discern what to include and exclude? Because if we include too much, we risk becoming quite an intense amount of data and concepts to work with. And if we exclude, then we risk alienating populations that otherwise might be quite relevant. So striking that balance is quite critical in undertakings like such. So any words of wisdom on how have you seen it being addressed?
Aditya, did you want to go?
No, you go first, please.
All right, I'm going to answer this from a digital marketing perspective, right? So when you talk about the Netflix scenario, the customization, there are a number of ways that you can do that. I mean, we all suffer from too much content out there. And just like Craig said, I think it's like going on a first date and having to list, you don't really talk about your entire life and ask someone to marry you on a first date. You go step by step, and that's where it gets interesting, right? So I would use that analogy. So how we've done it in our scenario is multiple ways. For example, we use geofencing. If we want to limit the experience or the landing page to a specific territory. Also for advertising, who sees the message? Maybe it's only meant for the global South audience, in which case we also geofence that on social media. And on HubSpot, for example, we work on the decade on restoration, and most of that audience comes from practitioners in the space that are, let's say, work specifically on mangrove restoration versus forest restoration. And so by capturing user data on them through sophisticated CRM tools like HubSpot, we capture the user behavior. And so we segment the audiences and have dedicated content and sort of conversion journey with them in a very customized manner. Aditya, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, and I think, just to address this question, and I see the ones from David also, like, how do you sort of avoid the Frankenstein of platforms when you're trying to do too much? I mean, I think that really speaks to sort of the iterative nature of thinking about how to do a user-centered design approach or a human-centered design approach, is that iteration is key. And as part of that iteration, what you're really focusing on is a particular use case, and what does that then mean for a prototype or a minimum viable product? And I guess just going back to one of the things that Craig was speaking to is that, when you're looking at sort of that Venn diagram of brokers and donors and so forth, and what does it really take to first sort of sell the concept, where you might not necessarily be focusing on the user, but more about really sort of creating the foundation of the project. There's, I think, a balance that's required at that level. And in most of the programs that we've worked on, there's always been this initial stage where you're really creating the business case for how this program is going to be developed in the long term. So there's a certain level of needs assessment that gets done, where you're engaging with users around what the needs and priorities are. You're building political support for the program. You're articulating what sort of an initial vision is. And as part of that, building like a very early prototype, a very minimum viable product that's focused on one or two use cases, and that's it, right? And that's one way to not go too far down the road without that level of user engagement, because then what's going to end up happening is that you've invested millions into an actual product that nobody knows. You don't know who the user is. You don't know how they're going to interact with it. You don't know if it's going to actually solve for the problem that they're working on. And now you've gone too far down the development path where you might have to restart, right? So I think it's really about being very kind of, sort of selling the concept and being creative about how you're selling the concept by still engaging with users at the right level that allows for the funding to then come in. And then, as Craig was saying, that once you've got that, right, then you're really sort of going full in on users, right? But being very incremental about how you develop that product. And again, it just comes back to really understanding your users and what those use cases are.
I wanted to just throw in an example from the startup world. You know, when you're launching a product, for example, Facebook, it didn't launch with all the bells and whistles. It staggered it, you know, so there was breathing room for the users to understand the first batch of core functionalities that perhaps drove to their immediate business targets. And then they kept expanding to explore different areas of growth as well. I think, you know, it's very possible that if you know, kind of build a product out with all bells and whistles at the get-go, unless you have a very clear seeding program, it may actually overwhelm users.
I think that's a really, really brilliant point that ties in very strongly to Aditya's point, where it's like, stop, try the solution that's, you know, an MVP, and then we can sort of iterate on based on the data and the input and the feedback we're getting. And for people who might not be familiar with MVP, it's minimum viable product, which is basically creating a first bare bones structure of a product based on some initial inputs and then iterating it based on the feedback that people receive. I think one question again is often, and this is not something particular, I'm sure within the UNEP environment, I've seen that quite a bit in the private sector as well, as, you know, as we undertake this process, you know, and we identify a certain use case and we're getting some input from a multiple range of stakeholders, there's often a tendency to be able to take those different inputs and just create one product that gets pushed out. Now, the trick in that happens particularly in sensitive applications, a lot of which UNEP undertakes, is risk either making it too intense, where if you take an input from everybody, or we're delineating certain people. And I think that balances can be a bit tricky to be maintained. Maybe if either of you, in your plethora of examples, can think of an example where you've sort of worked upon this iterative process of ensuring that good balance between what you take in and what you let go, and then creating a product that has flowed. I think that might be quite beneficial for all of us to hear, just as the process of at a high level of what it takes to do something like that.
Yeah, it's worth pointing out that, or at least recognizing that this idea of decide. So there's a sort of a famous design phrase, which is to design is to decide, right? So that there's and deciding in these terms is often quite a painful thing, and it doesn't feel very comfortable, and especially in the fact that we're in a space where we try and be inclusive, and not try and exclude anyone. Unfortunately, to decide is probably to exclude some people, and that doesn't feel very good. At least exclude some people initially, and that feels pretty horrible, and no one really wants to do that. So it's like there has to be a recognition that's built in. Is there good? And I can't think of a single time where we've gone through this process and it's been particularly pleasant. It's normally not very pleasant. I'm trying to think of a good example where it's where we've done this particularly well. Actually, I mean, the best example probably is that the Global Forest Watcher app, where there was a clear demand, a clear need. That mobile app could have been built for everyone. Oh, you know, the rest of the world has got mobile phones, we need it for that. But there was a clear partner that was involved in it. There was a clear need that was to define it. So we identified that one first. And WRI did a lot of this work. I shouldn't say this is us. WRI did a lot of this work. And from that, like, a very simple needs were met. And then the process of becoming more inclusive over time came from that. I'm just repeating really what Aditya and Pooja said around starting small and building out rather than starting big and going small. The former is much less expensive, which is also a good idea as well. I know David's mentioned this a few times now, so it's clearly he's going through this pain himself at the moment. But I would say look at how the decision making is working in the group. I think that plays a really important part. If this is a consensus-based decision-making process, you'll tend to find it's even more painful. At some point, you need some kind of consent or some kind of ownership of agreement, which allows you to exclude safely, if you like. I don't know the details of that one, so I can't be specific about that one. But I think that part is absolutely critical. you know, whoever decided to make these earphones slightly too big for my ears were really excluding me as well in this process.
A bad example of human-centered design, is it? I think, sorry, if people have to ask questions, please put in. We had put in the opportunity to get some FaceTime questions at the end of the session, so we can be all sort of cumulatively done with the panelists, and then we'll have an opportunity to come FaceTime. We had some time set aside, but if you have to leave and if you've got burning questions, please feel free to put them in the chat window. We'll make sure to address them, and because this is being recorded, we'll all have an opportunity to come and revisit this conversation, and also recognizing that this is a big, meaty, very intense topic. There's a lot of conversations that might not be able to answer, but the idea is to bring about an invitation for further exploration. I think these conversations always end up, at least for me, having more questions than when I began the conversation. But I think that's a good thing, because it's an invitation to go and explore further and ask further questions and keep that journey of exploration ongoing. So I think Twitter, there we go. Craig sort of just given you his Twitter handle, so you can go bombard him there. Now that Twitter is going to become unfiltered, thanks to a recent takeover, I think we can all share our thoughts openly without any filters. I think the goods and the bads will come with it, yes, and we can have a conversation on it a few months from now, for sure. Brilliant. I think before further delaying it, Pooja, I think I'll pass over the stage to you now to bring in really all of these conversations home and perhaps really show how UNEP has and is doing some of this work, and then we can open up for a bigger question flooring and have more in-face questions as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Shivam. You know, I have so many more questions to ask. And Craig, I took some notes, but yeah, hopefully I can come in with some practical ways we are using user-centered design. But I do want to call out that I think for user-centered design to work in organizations such as ours, where from a legacy perspective, it's been otherwise. And I think to do this successfully, we require champions, and we require champions who push user-centered design. So I'm so privileged to work with some colleagues here who are actually on the call, our head of design, coordinator for digital for the decade, who've really championed this. So go out and find your champions. But going back to practical applications. So I think Craig touched on it, and so did Aditya. User-centered design, if you look at that Venn diagram for us, is, you know, a lot of qualitative interviews, survey data, analytics, and in the middle of that Venn diagram, what we find is the real golden insights, and any person who's working on user-centered design will tell you how exciting it is to find those, let's say, undeniable truths that you use to build upon. But you know, on the right, I want to point out to something very specific, which is all of this is not just for design's sake, right? It is to drive your business objectives for whatever they may be. And in our case, it has been to drive growth in terms of website traffic. So from 2018 to 2022, you can see that sort of spike, and the way we've done it is really to push at every level to bring in a user-centered design approach. It hasn't always been easy because, you know, oftentimes you are working with teams or senior management that for whom this concept is often novel. But we've been lucky to have leaders and colleagues, like I said, who've championed this because they understand the business value that user-centered design can drive. And I think when you are thinking about user-centered design and applying it or selling it to your organization, I think this is an important thing to note, that it is about ultimately driving business value, business objectives, right? So how do we do it? We work with a pretty robust technical stack, tools, if you will, that help us continuously tap into our user mindset. We look at a number of different things. So these are some of the tools in our technical marketing stack. Everything from Mural, and I'll show you a couple of examples, to HubSpot, which tracks very sophisticated CRM and user behavior, to Optimizely, which is A/B testing, BuzzSumo, which is capturing content, audience sentiment, SPSS, statistical software that helps us cluster audiences based on user behavior, Google Analytics, Google Tag Manager, heat mapping tools, and a whole lot. So I'm going to just talk about a couple of examples. I think Anne-Catherine is here on this call. She's my co-partner in what we do for the Decade on Restoration. And because of our openness, we have been able to really, from start to where we are now, use user-centered design in the way we package the platform, in the way we develop even the look and feel. So at the moment, and maybe we'll have a chance to bring her on later, we are developing a concept for the Decade Marketplace, which is essentially a place where funders, implementers, projects come together to find common ground, essentially to drive restoration of ecosystems. But to do that, we didn't just start with a website. We had to understand the key value proposition. And like Craig said, it was often about understanding the business asks first. Like, what do we want to achieve before going out to the audiences to understand their needs and then start mapping it together. And oftentimes we use tools like Mural, where we bring these different stakeholder groups together to host these sort of chats and get them talking about the core themes, identifying core themes, right? But we also do it when we are designing campaigns. My other co-creator in this, Reagan, our head of design, is also on the call. But to design a campaign, when I came here, I often found that our general tendency was to put out campaigns just as beautiful works of art with a key message. But in today's very, very crowded landscape, it is so important to start outside in than inside out. We are not living in a megaphone world today. So, for example, last year for World Environment Day, before we started the campaign itself, we looked at just doing a little survey. We knew we had very engaged audiences. So we had a pop-up survey that you see on the right that asked folks, like, who are you? Because Google Analytics does not provide that granular of detail, right? We wanted to understand the psychographics, the sentiments, the needs, the emotions behind the zeitgeist. Where should we be going? And we wanted to include them. And so we asked them if they considered them an enthusiast or an environment warrior. We asked them, what do they feel in terms of the environment? Are they anxious? Are they hopeful? And we use this to design the campaign, the content. All of this went into informing how we presented the World Environment Day. And we also use it to make websites better. When I joined in 2019, we had taken a big radical move to centering the website around the end user, the individual. And what happened is the key stakeholders, the member states, the internal large network of audience got lost. We were not talking about who we were and what our mandate was, but going just straight to news and stories about the environment. And so there was a little bit of a disconnect between what the website was saying and what our mandate was. And we worked on a lot of surveys to understand the sentiment both inside the house and outside the house. And what we got is there was a level of dissatisfaction. And I believe if a website does not serve your needs, then we need to relook at that. So here's another tool that we use. It's a heat mapping tool where we can see where people are clicking, right? So with that initial navigation on the left that you see, we moved it around so it was more structured around what people were wanting to see, both from an internal and external perspective. And so then we started to see these heat maps, and on top of the screen you can see the heat maps where it's really yellow and red. That's where people were really clicking. And then this tool could also tell us exactly the number of clicks that came from those heat maps. And down below where you see Sir Attenborough is where we have landed, and we are continuously iterating. But this is an example to show you how we use user-centered design through surveys, through focus groups, through digital technology tools to continuously iterate the navigation and the website experience. But it doesn't just end at websites. Our core, we are a science-based organization, and our principal focus is around some key reports like the emission gap report. And one of the things that we've started doing is, again, going outside in. So, and really starting to measure or at least have a dipstick into what people think about our reports. Is it driving value? And how can we use that information then to feed back into the publishing / authorship piece process, right? So this is simply a pop-up. When you first open any report page, or at least the key report pages, you're always provided with a pop-up that asks you for a question, and we ask questions like, what is your main reason for visiting the page? Sometimes it's for personal interest, but other times it's for research or policy efforts. We also want to know, what are you like? Did you download it to read later? We have various formats of the report. Some of them are more summaries, and some of them have interactives. So it was a question really to understand their behavior so we could design the experience accordingly. And here you see on the right that most people download the report to read later. So this is a design opportunity. What can we put out there on the summary page that will really grab their attention so you get that first initial bait, initial interest, and hook them on to reading the report more. And then, of course, we found out a lot more about which sector they are in and many other questions as well. But, you know, this is a very, very small piece of the pie. We have a very long way to go. I think we are doing some interesting work in the communication space with colleagues that understand user-centered design. But generally, I think there is this notion of, I understand what the user needs. And so I will design it myself. But as Alan Cooper said, understanding the landscape or being victim of the problem does not automatically bestow on one the power to see the solution. There needs to be an approach, and that is a user-centered approach. And it's very different for every project. I think it needs to be based on the audiences, the platforms of usage, and that is where the first note of success could come. It's really about the design and the range. I think there was a question on, you know, including gender. So it's also including the right group audiences to answer these questions, not it has to be related to the platforms. And the last piece I would say is, so now that we've gotten your interest on human-centered design, where do you start? We've seen incredible platforms out there. We've seen, I hear an echo, background noise, but I'll go ahead and continue.
Sorry, if everybody can please go on mute, that'd be very kind.
All right, so where does one start? I really want to encourage everyone to note that human-centered design or this approach can be applied not just to campaigns, platforms, websites, but it can also be applied to projects. IDEO is a fantastic example of using human-centered design in building out projects at the ground level. So those of you who are working in programmatic areas, please take note of this. So how do you do that? Whatever you are working on, keep the user at the center of all your decisions. It is definitely more HCD, and doing your thorough research is definitely more reliable than your intuition or your gut. And I have to tell myself often, even for us HCD practitioners, I'm sure the colleagues on the panel will agree, there's often a tendency just sometimes to just move with your intuition, but I think oftentimes we have to check ourselves and talk to the people who are using your product, look at analytics, run surveys, conduct interviews, build your technical stack. And yeah, I'll leave you with that. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. I think that's really sort of ties together the whole picture of, the whole concept of HCD that we've been talking about, and how really from a tangible standpoint, we can see you're not leveraging and using it. I think I know I'm now, I'm as a moderator, I can't have favorite questions, but I do think there's one favorite question for me that's popped up, and I must sort of ask it, and then we can open up the floor for on-cam questions if anybody's got it. And I think the question that I want to sort of ask out is, and I've got to read it verbatim because it's very well put together. It's, how does user-centered design deal with designing for important information that users rather don't like to know about? So how do we address questions from a user-centered point that people don't want to know? That's a very, very important question. Any thoughts, insights from either of you?
Yeah. I wanted to chime in, but my microphone's not working.
Oh, we can hear you, Pooja.
We can hear you.
Okay, great. I think I'm going to frame this as a communication challenge, because oftentimes you need to convey things that are, that create decision fatigue for folks, like an insurance company, for example, right? I mean, life insurance. These are things that people don't really want to think about. Yet there are advertising agencies out there, and this is maybe because my background is in communication. There are folks out there, there are prolific agencies that are making life insurance sexy. It is possible, but because you can flip it, flip the way you see the coin. So I would say that that's one way of doing it.
You're saying we don't really need another phone every 6 months, yeah? David, oh sorry, Craig, Aditya, any insights from you? Before we sort of let people come on camera and ask any burning questions in the last 20 minutes we have left.
I'll just throw in one concept. I mean, I think part of that also comes back to data governance. There's a lot of sort of downstream implications of data products that get created that are often not thought about in the very beginning. So whether it's issues around privacy, what a particular data product might do for insurance purposes, once that insurance sort of mechanism goes into place, what does that then mean for communities that are living in a particular place? So really, I think a lot of it's a really good question. I'm trying to think of a really good example that I've come up against where somebody doesn't really want this information to be out. That's often been around issues of privacy, ethnicity, marginalized groups, sensitive information, and so forth, right? I think part of the user-centered design approach is to understand that complexity, to understand the culture, the local knowledge, if there's indigenous communities that need to be protected, what does all of that mean in terms of how you actually design your product to be able to be protective of the things that need to be protected, but at the same time create some kind of a governance mechanism that really thinks about those downstream implications around the products that are being created and what that then means for the institution, for the communities, for the individuals and so forth that you're, essentially trying to serve.
Thank you, Aditya. Craig, any final words before I invite people to ask any burning questions on cam?
No, but only one, which is just on the premise of the question, implies that you have to do what the users tell you, I think. And I'm not talking about sensitive information. I'm not talking about privacy. I'm not talking about any of those things which we shouldn't say. I'm talking about how literally you need to take the feedback. And it's worth pointing out that all the websites that you may have seen today and the great examples that Pooja gave you, ultimately it comes down to a pretty small group of people that know how to design, know how to write code, they know how to do user research, they know how to make decisions on what to build, and they have to again make those choices and those decisions. And so I think when users say they want or don't want something, it has to be taken in the context, especially with our type of work, in the context of everything else that's going on. And so if there are things which really need to be said and the user doesn't want to say them, putting aside the really sensitive stuff, perhaps they just need to be said, and that's okay.
Absolutely. And I think that's a very important point, so differentiating that user-centered design often, or it can't be and equated to the sentiment where we're always saying that the user is right in the sense. And I think that differentiating factor is quite important. So sorry, Pooja, you want to come in? Go ahead.
Yes, and I think Craig brought up a nuance which is very, very interesting, at least in our work. And again, we face this on an everyday basis. So it's about what user-centered design is and what it isn't. So users telling you what functionality they need is not user-centered design. And this may be obvious to some in this group, but I just want to make that clarification because as user-centered design is really trying to get to the bottom of the page, which is what is your core need? What kind of value can we drive, right? And often, like Steve Jobs was a pioneer on this, oftentimes they are not in the best position to really decipher what functionality could serve that need best. That is when experts such as Craig come to the table, say, great, we understand the need, let's take that away and come back to you with something that addresses those needs. Thanks.
Thank you, Pooja. So we've got about 15 odd minutes left here. I mean, I would invite, I can't see hands, sorry, my Teams doesn't allow me to see hands, so maybe if somebody can help me see who's got their hands up, and perhaps I would invite people to have.
I see a hand up from Chris. Shivam?
Chris, okay, wonderful. Chris, maybe if you can come on screen for us and ask your question. Again, I would invite people to keep their questions short, and if they can address it to a particular panel member, if they want that panel member to answer the question, or it can be a generic question to the panelists across. So just a couple of things in mind, and Chris, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I'll need to pay particular attention to the concept of compliance and due diligence in terms of environmental sustainability in in whatever service or in whatever service we deliver to our end users. So personally, I'm a business analyst and a digital business analyst. And whenever I try to build any services, I always make sure all requirements are gathered from all stakeholders. And then I'll define, analyze, I'll also document this. And for me, I think that it doesn't matter how beautiful the website look alike, but the major thing is about all the functionalities, all the required to get the background running. But my fear is about the sustainability because now as we are speaking, we are using all these apps, but we are not taking into account where natural resources are coming from, the one that are allowing us to interact with each other. Also about all this Project PED we are talking about. So we have left the Democratic Republic of Congo, the country that is sustaining us with all these beautiful things. We have left it unattended in the hand of criminals. And at the same time, we are still talking about how we can implement all these good things in order to be able to be communicating. So I think this, if we are not taking a particular care, this might hinder the way we are trying to do anything. So back to the audience, I think that's what I had to say, because I'm a member of the digital coalitions, and I thought that if I couldn't say something about this, I'll be useless, because I come from the Democratic Republic of Congo, particularly in the east parts, where all these things, the advantages we are getting from that particular country, the people themselves are not getting use of them, but it's other people, proxies. And so we are not trying to make this user-centered. And I'm really speechless. Thank you very much, the panel.
Maybe just thank you first, Chris, for really sharing that sentiment across. And I personally do resonate with it. I come from South Africa myself. We've had our own share of such issues, and I really want to thank you and applaud you for bringing that very important question forward. So maybe back to the panelists, if you've got any thoughts on it, that how do we really consider the increasing disparity in the global value chains, right? Like as we are talking about creating solutions and products that are servicing parts of the world and parts of the audiences. I mean, it's how do we start to think about these ideas now? Maybe Craig, you mentioned planet-centered designs, but is it something that is already currently happening? Have you seen any best principles that are being applied to such undertakings? And if not, how do we start to have this conversation in a bit more upfront manner? Any thoughts, ideas, insights from either of you would be lovely.
Craig, you going, or you want me to go, or
you go first?
Aditya, you unmuted yourself first, so now that's it. The person who unmutes
Okay.
first has to go in. That's the rule of the game. So
yeah, no, I mean it's a really good question. I mean, obviously this is sort of it's also a very hard question to answer, because I mean this is the complexity that is on the ground. So yes, thank you very much for that question, and I probably don't have the right answer to it either. I will say that working in countries that are in conflict or post-conflict or heavily marginalized, there's a reality to the world that you're dealing with that others don't really understand or don't have that same perspective. So I think at some level, you're still trying to be as inclusive as you possibly can in being able to sort of understand the users that you are trying to reach and trying to provide the voice to them in terms of what that means for anything that is developed. How successful or not that's going to be, it's really sort of dependent on the situation that you're struggling with to begin with. But if there's a way to be as inclusive as possible and to provide access and capacity development around those solutions that are being developed, I think that's what we're all, what you're aiming for, what we're aiming for, and how that works, within the political context, within the cultural context, is going to be highly variable depending on the country that you're working in. But I think at the center of it all is, if you can have the reach that you're looking for and be able to incorporate that perspective and input, and also provide perspective also from a capacity development perspective, hopefully that makes some change happen.
Thank you, Aditya. Craig, Pooja, any insights from you? Craig, maybe would love to see if you've got any insights, particularly in the examples you've undertaken, because I'm sure you've worked with sort of individuals and entities across the world. Any thoughts to close off Aditya's comments?
Yeah, and like Aditya mentioned, I'll pick a couple of pieces of the discussion just and try and use those, and maybe just think of a couple of principles. I'm obviously, running a company full of makers from actually all over the place, not just in Spain where our main base is. I'm really aware that the technology that gets built normally best serves the needs of people if built in the places where it's being used. And now I know there's many places in the world where that might not be possible today. However, the more we can encourage these innovation hubs, the more we can encourage these new areas in the world where internet connectivity is now a real possibility or exists already, or maybe there's some satellites out there now which is beaming down internet to places. I think that gives me a certain amount of hope that you can create these communities. It's obviously very complicated. It's obviously to be able to build stable communities of engineers and designers and product makers into these areas. But that's where I would go first. So when the opportunity arises, then you create, some of these innovation hubs. I mean, having been at the UNEP for a while, the innovation hub in Nairobi, for example, was a fantastic example, which whatever it was 15 years ago when I was there, was kind of emerging and became a real powerhouse, I think, in a kind of economic development there. So that's probably where I'd start. That's probably where I'd add to that. I mean, the ramifications of conflict in the world is hitting us at the moment, largely because of the people that we work with in Ukraine, and our ability to continue working with them when they're faced with what they're facing there. So there's no easy answer to this. I just hope there's enough stability to create a community of people that can go make things for their people. I think then you're onto something.
Yeah, and I think it will take active accountability and active conversations on all of our parts to be able to intentionally embed this conversation in all the digital undertakings that we do, is that we talk about fundamentally the end-to-end value chains and supply chains to ensure that that conversation is brought up in all our digital undertakings. I think it's critical. David, sorry, I see your hand. I can't see your hand, but I've been told that your hand's up. So final question from you. We've got about 5 minutes. So quick question, and then we'll get some answers, then we'll wrap up.
Thanks so much. This is a question. I have two questions, one for Craig and one for Pooja. Craig, I think I've been asking a lot of questions in the chat specifically about data platforms and specifically about kind of multi-thematic data platforms that have different kinds of functionalities. And I'm curious from your perspective, is it possible to build a single platform that can deal with multiple themes and multiple functions and multiple users, or should we be looking at developing bespoke platforms that meet very specific needs on very specific themes? So it's kind of like Global Forest Watch, Global Fishing Watch, whatever the other thematics are, versus kind of Resource Watch. Like what's the best practice now in terms of targeted thematics versus one platform to rule them all? So that's a question for Craig. Question for Pooja. Pooja, in the revamp of the UNEP website, I want to get a couple of examples of what did you exclude? What did you actually not take into account in terms of some of the content or in terms of the redesign based on some of the analytics you collected? Thanks very much.
Okay. Right. So good question. I don't think there's one to rule them all, but that's not really the answer. So I think you have to look at the communities of practice and how well defined they are, and start from that. And then you have to look at the the hidden data, the hidden technology that's hindering those communities from achieving their targets. In the case of Global Fishing Watch, it was pretty obvious, although difficult to do, that understanding where fishing boats were in the middle of the sea when there's not many people around was incredibly important in the governance of the high seas and actually inshore waters as well. It was important to understand when illegal fishing was happening in these kind of commons areas. And so it really made sense. And there was a whole governance and community of people that's been centered around this for the last hundreds of years. And so in that case, you go, okay, so those particular pieces of knowledge will really unlock that group. And then it turns out that that type of knowledge also helps with governments in deciding where to put marine protected areas, or deciding on the supply of protein to their citizens, or all sorts of other things. So you start with addressing the community problem, but you create it in a way. I'm a firm believer of like public open data sets, then to stream out to other places. And maybe that turns into a bigger application which can be used wider and further, or maybe not. Maybe it's purely then just the data, the APIs, some visualization services which get people started. And you get to that point and you're good. There are, though, communities, and often it's our communities that are really interested in data from all over the place. And often they're highly technical people. They're wanting to do things with maps. They're wanting to do analysis. They're wanting to do this big data analysis. They're wanting to understand the planet as a whole and do all sorts of good and bad things with that type of knowledge. In those cases, a platform to consume them all is actually not a terrible idea, providing you understand the needs of that community. And in like the case of Resource Watch and UN Biodiversity Lab and others similar to that, it makes a lot of sense to put biodiversity data right alongside, some other human pressure data, agricultural practices or something. It makes sense there because it's our community needs that to be able to ask the whys of the the questions that we're trying to answer. But the danger becomes when it focuses purely around just the idea of the data, like the idea of isn't it a technologically interesting thing to do? Nothing wrong with that either, by the way. But in our broad cases, we're more interested on the impact that as a result of the applications. I don't know. In the case of, I've seen this fail a lot actually over the years. Those that are old enough to remember UNEP.net, UNEP Live, all of these type of products where they're trying to solve all the problems that they never quite worked. They were kind of too big. The users weren't specific enough. Actually, the community didn't seem to actually need it, and so that ultimately ended up being the problem. And so from that, I think you have to base it on the communities, right? Let's hope some of these other ones coming along. The other thing I would say on that, there is a natural inclination, and we've all been around a while now, that sees this need to have, I don't know if it's a human, like it's a deep human thing, to think we can be able to understand all of the world for everything. And once we understand all of the world and all of ourselves, then we'll be good. So there's this natural inclination to like make the product like there's a million of these. It's probably got the word intelligence, planet, earth, something like that built into it, right? There's probably these terms. And what they're really about is someone's gone, yeah, I think we can bring together AI and machine learning and big data and cloud technologies to completely understand the planet. And once we understand it, we'll be able to predict what's going to happen in the future. And then you go, oh my God, this is so complex. Like you're getting down to the meaning of life complex, and they tend to fail as a result of that. Maybe we step a little bit further in our knowledge, but they tend to fail. So I don't know why. Every few years, these keep coming back round, and then some major philanthropist thinks it's a great idea and pumps loads of money into it, and then it sort of gradually withers away after about 5 years. Maybe at some point, technology will be at a point where that doesn't happen anymore, but I don't know. I always look at those with a little air of suspicion. I'm not suggesting that you're heading in that route at all, David, by the way. That wasn't my intention, because I don't think you are. But yeah, it is something to keep an eye on.
I think two conversations we have to come back to now, Craig. I mean, first planet-centered design and now human existentialism. I'm like, wow, this is damn. We can't do this twice in a meeting, man. Like, we've got to come back to this now. But Pooja, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to answer David's question, but I do want to chime into what Chris had mentioned before, but I'll save that for later. So to go back to David's question, what did we exclude? I think for us, it was easier in a way than a new product, because we were sitting on years of analytics, which told us what people gravitate to versus not. So we knew right from get-go what are the key priorities that we need to have on there, and what are the things that we can, kind of communicate on a secondary level. And likewise, when we heard from people on qualitative surveys, often they asked for custom experiences. And for a large website like UNEP, it was not possible to service more than 300 clients in custom experiences. So what we did is we derived common themes from across the board, and we tried to look at commonalities and build out templates that sort of met in the middle, that served most needs. So I hope that answered that question. But I want to go back to Chris, and I want to mention something very interesting that I've been listening to. Audrey, 80,000 Hour podcast, where Audrey Tang was a guest speaker. He speaks about inclusive digital democracy, and he works with tools that are, one of them is Polis, where people are up voting and down voting. It's not like a town hall like Twitter where people comment and bash at each other, but it's just finding common ground. And these are low-tech tools. So I think this is a very interesting challenge for those of us working in this space to take back with us. So when we work on big platforms that are high tech, and we need to think of packaging them. So it's not just about, we need to package them in different formats so it's accessible to those that may not get the full experience. And I think this is where we need to break silos and work with data experts, communication experts. Like everyone has this huge penetration of smartphones today. At least you have WhatsApp. In most countries, some have banned them, but I think there are ways to package it at levels where the global south and places that have difficulty maybe with bandwidth can participate, can view these, and ultimately use them for decision making and participate in policy making as well. So I'll pause there. Thanks.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Pooja. I think we have 5 minutes over time, so I think we did quite well for time. Really appreciate all the conversations and thoughts and ideas. And again, like I was saying earlier on, I think this is just an invitation for further conversations and knowledge gathering. But I hope that this was a session that sparked some interest in this very important concept and sparked some very important conversations that we must be having collectively to progress this. So thank you again very much for your time. Really appreciate you all being here. I'm sure we'll see you very soon again.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Shivam. Thanks, Craig. Thanks, Pooja. Thanks, Aditya. Wonderful to see you all.
Yeah, you too, Dave.
Thank you.